The left glove was wrong from the start. Marsh noticed it at 4:40, under the fluorescent strip in the kit room at Wellington Barracks, the kind of light that makes every man look like he's already dead. He pulled it on. Flexed. The fabric shifted a quarter-inch past his knuckle, loose in the way that wasn't dramatic enough to report but wrong enough to feel. The way a stone in a boot isn't an emergency until hour 6, and then it's the only thing in the world. He reported it anyway. Corporal Hinds looked at the glove, looked at Marsh, looked at the glove again with the expression of a man being asked to resolve a theological dispute before breakfast. It'll sit fine once you're positioned. It won't. Marsh. Corporal. Hinds signed off on the kit sheet. Marsh took the glove. The glove was wrong and it was going to stay wrong, and that was the full extent of what could be done about it, which in Marsh's experience described roughly 60% of all situations a man encountered in his life if he was paying attention. He was 39 years old, 17 years Grenadier Guards, 2 tours that he'd stopped describing at parties because the way people's faces moved when he described them had started to bother him more than the tour themselves. He had a flat in Pimlico with a boiler that worked 8 months of the year, and a sister in Coventry he rang on Sundays when he remembered, and occasionally when he didn't. His grandmother had died in 1997, 3 weeks after Diana. Nobody had queued for his grandmother. She'd have found that funny, actually. She'd have said something dry about it, something that landed sideways, something you'd still be thinking about 4 days later in the car. She was like that. The women of that generation were like that. They'd absorbed so much that the only language left was oblique. He thought about that sometimes. Not now. Now he had a briefing. Sergeant Major Collings ran through the rotation schedule with the enthusiasm of a man delivering a planning permission update. 4-day lying-in state period beginning April 5th. Westminster Hall. Rotating vigil pairs, 45-minute positions, absolute stillness, eyes front. No acknowledgement of members of the public regardless of what they said or did or how long they stood there doing it. The last part had a weight to it that nobody acknowledged. Regardless of what they said or did or how long they stood there doing it. Marsh had done vigil work before, trooping the color, the cenotaph. He understood the mechanics. You became furniture. Meaningful furniture, symbolically loaded furniture, but furniture nonetheless. The public needed something to look at that wasn't looking back. That was the job. That was the whole job broken down to its bones. "Any questions?" Collings said, in the tone of a man who had not actually asked a question. Nobody had any questions. Marsh looked at his left hand. The glove sat there, slightly too large, waiting. Westminster Hall smelled of cold stone and cut flowers and something older than both. Marsh had been inside it before ceremony rehearsals, 2 of them, both times in the early morning when the hall was empty and your footsteps made the kind of sound that reminded you how small you were against 800 years of ceiling. He'd looked up both times. You couldn't help it. The hammer beam roof did something to your sense of scale that no amount of military bearing could fully counteract. Now the hall was not empty. He took his position at 900 on the second day of the lying-in state. 4 days total. 200,000 people, they were saying, though nobody knew yet because 200,000 people were still coming. The queue stretching back along the embankment, past Lambeth Bridge. People who had been standing in it since the previous evening with folding chairs and flasks, and the particular expression of people who have decided that something matters enough to be uncomfortable for. Marsh stood, eyes front, Busby on, chin strap precise, left glove slightly, persistently, incorrectly loose. You weren't supposed to watch the cue. Eyes front meant eyes front, a fixed point on the middle distance, the ceremonial blankness that was its own form of respect, or its own form of armor depending on which way you looked at it. The point was not to look like you were choosing not to engage. You were meant to appear as if engagement was simply not a category available to you. Stone, gold, red, Britain. But you saw things. You couldn't not see things. The eyes go front, but peripheral vision is not a thing you can discipline out of a human being. And after the first hour, Marsh had a fairly comprehensive picture of what was passing him without having technically looked at any of it. Old people, that was the first thing. Not exclusively. There were young people, families, a school group on the second morning that moved in a silence clearly imposed from outside them, and therefore slightly more moving for the effort it visibly cost. But disproportionately, overwhelmingly, the queue was old. The queue was people in their 80s who had taken a coach from somewhere, who had brought a good coat, who moved carefully but absolutely. None of the hesitation of people who are there because they think they should be. All of the deliberateness of people who are there because they made a calculation, and the calculation came down firmly on the side of this matters. I will go. Marsh watched them not watching them. A man about 80, trilby hat, stood at the catafalque for 40 seconds before his son, clearly his son, same jaw, 30 years younger, gently touched his elbow. The man didn't move for another 10 seconds. Then he nodded once to the coffin, the way you'd nod to a colleague you'd known a long time. Not reverence exactly, recognition. A woman who had to be 90, bent in a way that suggested her spine had been making its own decisions for some years now, had made it to the front of the queue, and then simply stopped moving, and stood there with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes doing something complicated that Marsh couldn't see, and didn't need to see because he'd seen it before in other contexts on other people's faces, and he knew what it was. She was doing arithmetic. She was counting. He'd seen soldiers do it, the ones who'd been somewhere long enough to have a list, counting back through the list, finding faces in it. She was doing the same thing standing in front of a dead queen who had also been a young woman during the Blitz, who had also stood in bombed streets, who had apparently said she was glad Buckingham Palace had been hit because now she could look the East End in the face. Marsh's grandmother had told him that story 3 times. He'd believed it all 3 times. He still believed it. His left glove shifted. He flexed his hand once minimally against his side, resettling the fabric. Hins had been wrong. It had not sat fine once he was positioned. It was exactly as wrong as it had been at 4:40 under the fluorescent strip. Some things stay exactly as wrong as they start. She came through on the afternoon of the second day. Green wool coat, good quality. The kind that had been good quality 40 years ago and had been maintained since then with the careful attention of someone who understood that quality was a reason to preserve a thing, not an excuse to replace it. White hair pinned. Handbag over the left arm. She was a Marsh estimated, without looking, somewhere between 85 and 90, which meant she had been somewhere between 35 and 40 when the war ended, which meant she had been in it, properly, the whole shape of it start to finish. She reached the catafalque. She stopped. Protocol allowed for a moment of pause. A natural moment, a breath, a bowing of the head. What it did not allow for, and what the attendant gentlemen ushers were trained to gently discourage, was the kind of extended stillness that disrupted the flow of 200,000 people waiting in a line that stretched to Lambeth Bridge. The woman in the green coat stood for what Marsh's internal clock registered as approximately 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Nobody moved her on. The ushers, both of them within range, did not step forward. Marsh didn't know if they'd made a decision or if she'd simply made herself unmovable by some quality he couldn't name. Something in the set of her back. Something that said, I have been patient for 60 years, and I will take my 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and that is that. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She stood with her handbag over her left arm and her eyes on the coffin, and she stood in the particular way of someone who is having a private conversation in a public room, and has decided the public room is simply going to have to accommodate that. Marsh's left glove slipped. Not dramatically, a 1/4 inch. The same 1/4 inch it had been threatening all morning. The small, persistent wrongness of it finally expressing itself in the one moment he needed everything to be exactly right. He felt it. The fabric at the base of his little finger, the slight loosening, the gap between the glove and his hand that hadn't been there a second ago. He did not move. His hand in the regulation position against his thigh stayed exactly where it was. He did not flex. He did not adjust. The glove sat wrong and he stood right, and those two facts existed simultaneously, and that was the job. That was the whole job. That was 17 years of being the job. The woman in the green coat turned to go. She had gone 3 steps when she stopped again and looked back at the coffin once more. Not a long look, a quick one. The kind you give a thing you're leaving because you want to carry the last image of it clearly. And then she walked on and was gone into the slow current of people moving toward the exit, and Marsh never saw her again. He stood there. Left glove wrong. Hall cold. Flowers somewhere behind him, releasing their scent into 800 years of stone. He thought about his grandmother. He had not planned to think about his grandmother. He thought about her anyway, the way she used to sit in her kitchen in Wolverhampton with the radio on, not listening to it, just keeping it company, and the way she talked about the war the way other people talked about a bad winter. Matter-of-factly, with occasional dark humor, never asking for recognition, never quite sure what recognition would even look like if it arrived. She had met the Queen Mother once. A factory visit, 1943, somewhere in the Midlands. She'd been one of 40 women in a line, and the Queen had her words looked at her properly. Not the diplomatic glance, the actual look. She told Marsh this story once and only once, and had followed it immediately with a story about a foreman who had once slipped on a grease patch and fallen into a vat of something she described only as very unpleasant. And they had both laughed, and the first story had been absorbed into the second. And that was how she handled things. That was the whole technique. That was all of it. Looked at her properly. Marsh stood in Westminster Hall and thought about that for the remaining 23 minutes of his rotation. His father had not talked about the war. This was not unusual. His father's entire generation of men had not talked about the war with a consistency that amounted to a collective decision, a cultural agreement reached without a meeting, a handshake never made. You knew they'd been in it. You could see it occasionally in the way they reacted to certain sounds, certain silences. His father had always changed the channel when newsreel footage came on, not dramatically, not with any display of emotion, just a quiet reach for the remote. A quiet replacement with something else. The subject closed the way a window is closed against rain. Not anger, just preference. Marsh had joined up at 22. His father had said nothing, which from that man meant something, though Marsh had never fully worked out what. Not disapproval, there wasn't the temperature of disapproval in it. More like a man who'd been hopping the river would go a different way and had accepted it hadn't and was now watching it go the way it went. He died in 1999. Lung cancer, which surprised nobody, a habit of 40 years arriving at its natural conclusion. He'd been in hospital for 3 months and they'd talked, properly talked, more in those 3 months than in the previous 39 years combined, and still the war had not come up. Not once. The door had stayed closed. Marsh had eventually understood that the door was not going to open and had stopped waiting by it. He thought about this standing in Westminster Hall. He thought about how his grandmother and his father had lived through the same years and processed them in opposite directions. One through language, stories, dark jokes, the grinding mechanism of telling. The other through absolute silence. A silence so total it had its own weight, its own presence, like a piece of furniture you learn to walk around. And here in this hall were 200,000 people who had apparently decided to be neither. They had decided to come and stand and not speak, and not be silent either, to do something in between that didn't have a good name, that was somewhere between witness and goodbye, that was specifically human in a way that Marsh couldn't fully articulate but could feel in his chest in a manner that was professionally inconvenient. He was not supposed to feel things in his chest during a vigil rotation. He felt them anyway. The hall moved around him, face after face after face passing the catafalque, each one arriving at the same point and doing their own version of the same thing the woman in the green coat had done, each one carrying their own arithmetic, their own count of the lost, their own version of 1940 or 1944 or 1953 or some other year that had marked them in a way that had never fully unmarked itself. Marsh's left glove was still wrong. He had stopped noticing it, which surprised him. Somewhere in the last hour it had gone from a constant low-level irritant to simply part of the landscape of the day, filed alongside the cold stone and the flowers and the hammer beam roof, and the 200,000 people coming to say something to someone who could no longer hear them. Maybe that was fine. Maybe some things stayed wrong, and you stopped fighting the wrongness and just stood in it, and that was its own kind of right. He didn't pursue that thought. He was a soldier, not a philosopher, but it sat there anyway in the back of his mind, where thoughts go when you can't deal with them during working hours. His replacement arrived at the side entrance. Marsh performed the changeover with the precision of 17 years and walked out of Westminster Hall into the grey London afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment doing nothing at all. A tourist took his photograph. He didn't react. He was still furniture out here. He was still the thing people needed to look at that wasn't looking back. He supposed that was fine too. The funeral was April 9th. Marsh was en route duty, which meant he was one of the long red line that bordered the procession route from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey, and then on to Windsor. The human frame around the painting, the visible edge of the thing that told the crowd where their part ended and the ceremony's part began. He'd been briefed on crowd estimates. It didn't matter. You could brief a man on crowd estimates, and it would still not prepare him for the actual sensation of standing in front of that many people packed that tightly in silence, which was not really silence at all, but something more specific. The sound of 200,000 people collectively deciding not to make their usual sound, the effort of it audible in a way that genuine silence never is. The gun carriage came. Marsh had seen the rehearsal. He knew the pace, the timing, the weight and rhythm of it. He knew that the Queen Mother's 4 grandsons would walk behind the king, as he now was, and his brothers, and that the walk was something like 3 miles, which is a long way to walk behind your grandmother with the whole country watching your face. He looked front. The carriage passed. And here is the thing about ceremony that they don't brief you on, the thing that 17 years doesn't fully prepare you for. It works. Whatever the mechanism is, the music, the pace, the collective weight of that many people all oriented toward the same thing at the same moment, it works on you whether you want it to or not. It bypasses the professional exterior and does something directly to whatever is underneath it. And what is underneath it is just a man, just a person, just someone who had a grandmother who'd met this woman in a factory in 1943 and been looked at properly, and had told that story once and only once and then made it disappear into a funnier story about a foreman and a vat of something unpleasant. Marsh stood in his position on the route. The cortege moved past him at the pace that grief sets when grief is made official, which is slower than you expect and more final than you're ready for. He thought about the woman in the green coat. He thought about the man with the trilby who had nodded to the coffin the way you nod to a colleague. He thought about 200,000 people in a queue that stretched to Lambeth Bridge, standing in it with folding chairs and flasks, people who had made the calculation and come down on the side of this matters. I will go. He thought about his grandmother saying she looked at me properly. He thought about his father reaching for the remote. He thought about the glove, which was still wrong, which would probably always be wrong, which he had at some point simply accepted as the condition of the day. The procession moved on. The crowd absorbed it. Marsh stood in the line of red and black and gold, indistinguishable from the man to his left and the man to his right, which was precisely the point, which had always been precisely the point. You did not mourn here. You held the frame so other people could. That was it. That was the whole job. You stood in the frame, and you held it so everyone else could do the thing that you were not permitted to do. And you did this because someone had to. And because you were trained to. And because there was a version of service that had nothing to do with action and everything to do with stillness. And because 17 years ago, a 22-year-old from Wolverhampton had signed his name on a form. And that form, followed to its logical conclusion, had delivered him here to this street, on this morning. In a glove that didn't fit, holding a frame around other people's grief. The music moved away down the street. The crowd exhaled. Marsh did not. The pub was called The Speaker, 5 minutes from the barracks, the kind of place that had absorbed 30 years of post-ceremony guardsmen without ever once asking them what they were feeling, which was part of why they kept coming back. Marsh was there by 7. Lance Corporal Pete Adamy was already at the bar, out of uniform now, looking like a man who had taken off a suit of armor and wasn't sure what shape he was without it. Which was, Marsh supposed, approximately correct. They got their pints. They sat. They did the thing guardsmen do in pubs after these days, which is talk about everything except the thing they've been doing in enough detail and with enough apparent engagement that the conversation looks complete from the outside. Adamy talked about his car, which was developing a noise he hadn't paid enough attention to when it started and was now paying too much attention to when it hadn't stopped. Marsh listened, asked a question about it, got an answer. The car took 6 minutes. Then Adamy said, without preamble, without any transition, "My nan came through the queue." Marsh looked at him. "Yesterday, Tuesday, she didn't tell me she was going to. I found out because my mum rang." He turned his pint. "She's 81. She took the coach up from Croydon on her own, stood in it for 4 hours." Marsh said nothing. "She met her once, during the war, some event, she always talked about it." Adamy looked at his pint the way people look at things when they're not looking at them. "She said the Queen actually talked to her. Not just the moving down the line thing. Actually stopped." Marsh thought about, looked at me properly. "Did she get close?" he said, "to the front?" "Yeah, Mum said she stood there for ages." Adamy took a drink. "Mum was worried because of her hip, but apparently she was fine. Apparently, she was more fine than she's been in a while." They sat with that. The pub moved around them in its normal way. Its absolutely normal Tuesday evening way. People at other tables having their own conversations about their own cars and their own families and their own week. None of it touching what was in the air between Marsh and Adamy, which was something neither of them was going to name because naming it would have been a different kind of conversation. And they were both, by training and by temperament, more comfortable with the oblique. "Did you have anyone," Adamy said, "in the queue?" "No," Marsh said. "My gran died in 97. "Right. She'd have gone," he said. "If she'd been, she'd have taken the coach and stood in it for 4 hours, and she'd have found 3 people to talk to in the queue, and she'd have come home and made it into a story about something else." Adamy smiled at that. That generation. "Yeah. They drank." Marsh turned his glass. "My glove was wrong the whole time," he said. "Left hand too big, kept going." Adamy looked at him, with the expression of a man reassessing a theological dispute. "You're telling me that now?" "Nothing to tell, it was wrong. Stayed wrong, didn't fall off." Adamy shook his head slowly. "You stood a 2-hour rotation with a dodgy glove." 45 minutes, Marsh corrected, because precision was precision. "Still, it wasn't." Marsh paused. He looked at his left hand on the table, gloveless now, a normal hand, slightly wide across the knuckle, nothing remarkable about it. It wasn't the glove that was the problem. The glove was just the glove. Adamy looked at him. Marsh looked back. Neither of them said anything else about it, because there was nothing else to say. because the thing that needed saying had been as nearly said as either of them was going to say it. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole conversation in the frame of not the conversation, and they both knew it, and that was fine. That was the technique. The women of that generation had it. His grandmother had it. The woman in the green coat in Westminster Hall had stood in front of a dead queen for 2 minutes and 40 seconds and done what she came to do without a word spoken. And that was a version of the same technique. And 200,000 people had queued to Lambeth Bridge with their folding chairs and their flasks, and they had all, every single one of them, been doing some version of the same technique. You couldn't say the thing. So you went. You stood in it. You did your version of being present for it. You held the frame, or you stood in the queue, or you made it into a story about something else. And through all of these different mechanisms, the thing got said anyway, sideways, oblique, in the way that was the only way. His left glove was in his coat pocket. Still wrong. Still slightly too large at the base of the little finger, the fabric persisting in its quarter-inch displacement from where it was supposed to be. The small, irreducible wrongness of it surviving the day completely intact. He'd hand it back to stores tomorrow. Fill in a requisition form for a replacement. Hinds would sign off on it with the expression of a man resolving a theological dispute. And somewhere in the system, a correctly sized left glove would make its way to him and fit properly, and he would pull it on and flex and feel nothing, which was how it was supposed to feel, which was the whole point. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Adami ordered 2 more pints and said something about the car noise returning on the M25 last Thursday, and Marsh listened properly. The way you listen to a thing when you know the thing underneath it, when you know what the car is, and what the M25 is, and what last Thursday was, and you let the man talk about it in the only language available to him. The pub held them both. The city outside continued. Somewhere along the M4 corridor, the cortege was long since arrived at Windsor, and the Queen Mother was in the ground next to her husband and her daughter, and the people who had come from Croydon and the people who had come from wherever else were on their coaches going home, carrying whatever they'd come to deposit and hadn't quite been able to, still carrying it, taking it back with them, which was fine, which was how it always worked. You came, you stood in it, you took most of it home. The small part you left behind was the whole point of the journey. Marsh finished his pint, looked at his left hand one more time, turned his glass. David Marsh served 23 years in the Grenadier Guards. He retired in 2008. He never did get a correctly fitted left glove issued before the next ceremony rotation. He stopped reporting it after the 3rd form. His grandmother's name was Edna. She worked the factory line in Wolverhampton from 1941 to 1945. She met the Queen Mother on March 14, 1943, during a morale visit to the West Midlands Industrial District. She was looked at properly. She never forgot it.